He slumped alone in the garden and awoke to discover two young girls had preserved his existence. The day had begun like any other for James Brooks, though he was unaware it would conclude with his survival teetering on the edge. As one of the wealthiest men in the nation and the head of a vast building conglomerate, James was accustomed to navigating life with precision and intent. His schedule was planned to the second, and every move he made typically had a purpose behind it. But that morning, for the first time in ages, he sent his chauffeur away and opted to stroll through the garden en route to his workplace. He convinced himself it was for a fresh breeze, perhaps a serene pause before a hectic executive session, but deep inside he was merely weary of concrete barriers, of darkened glass, of the gap between himself and reality. Clad in a custom navy suit, his shoes impeccably shined, James appeared as a man in total command. His jet-black hair was tidily arranged, and his piercing green eyes surveyed the trail ahead through stylish shades. Birds sang softly in the distance, runners jogged by with earbuds in, and the fragrance of blossoming plants permeated the early summer atmosphere. The garden was tranquil, typical, and serene. But within James, something felt wrong. He couldn't pinpoint it initially, just a faint heaviness in his torso, a slight constriction in his breathing, but he dismissed it. He had a habit of ignoring unease. Discomfort meant little when contracts were at stake. He reached the midpoint of the primary trail before everything shifted. The world abruptly swayed, his sight dimmed, and a surge of dizziness overwhelmed him. He halted and clutched the steel barrier beside the trail, attempting to stabilize himself. His heart started racing unevenly, as if something within him had broken its tempo. The ache in his chest grew sharper. He gasped. Once, attempted to move forward, but his legs buckled beneath him. The earth rushed up swiftly and harshly, and then there was only stillness. His body struck the pavement with a muted thud, sprawled across the walkway like a man who had merely dozed off during work. But this was no rest. He wasn't stirring. His breaths had become faint and erratic, and his complexion was ashen, nearly greyish. Nearby people didn't notice at first. A couple strolled by, engrossed in their chat. A teenager on a scooter zoomed past without a glance. Time flowed normally for everyone but James, who lay silently between life and oblivion under the morning light. And that was the precise instant when two tiny figures emerged on the trail, holding hands. Lily and Ava, 5-year-old identical twins with wavy golden hair and wide hazel eyes, were walking through the garden on their way to the clinic. Dressed in light cotton dresses that swayed with each step, they seemed like characters from a storybook. But they were not on a whimsical outing. They had been at the playground earlier, seeking distraction from the reason they frequented this path. Their mother had been unconscious for a month, and every few days their grandmother escorted them to see her in the clinic a few streets away. That day, they were walking alone. Their grandmother had grown weary and trusted them to follow the familiar route by themselves. Lily was the first to spot the man lying on the ground. She pulled Ava's arm and pointed. "He's not moving," she said, her voice soft with worry. The girls stepped closer, uncertain whether to be frightened or helpful. James didn't seem threatening, just very still. His eyes were shut, and his face was motionless. "Is he not breathing?" Lily murmured. Ava knelt beside him. She had seen someone collapse once and recalled what to do. "I think we need to call someone," she said firmly. Reaching into her small backpack, she pulled out a blue toy-like phone, a real one, programmed by their grandmother with a few emergency numbers. She pressed the large red button marked "Help" and waited for a response. When the 911 operator answered, Ava's voice was steady and clear. She told them they were in the garden near the statue, that a man had fallen and wasn't waking. She gave their names and mentioned they were heading to the clinic. Her words were straightforward, but they sufficed. The operator dispatched an ambulance immediately. Ava held Lily's hand tightly as they stood near James, watching over him, like a child guards an injured sparrow. Within minutes, sirens echoed in the distance. 2 paramedics hurried down the trail with gear, one already checking James's vitals as the other began CPR. A third voice relayed updates via radio. The girls stepped back but stayed nearby. One paramedic glanced at them briefly. "Did you make the call?" Ava nodded. He smiled. "You likely just saved his life." They didn't smile back. They simply watched as the stranger in the fine suit with the still face was lifted onto a stretcher and wheeled away. Then Lily took Ava's hand again, and they continued their walk to the clinic as planned. They had no clue that the man they had just saved wasn't just anyone. He was James Brooks, a tycoon, a CEO, a man who had never been rescued by anyone until that moment. The clinic room was silent except for the gentle hum of machines and the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. James Brooks slowly opened his eyes to a haze of white ceiling panels and bright lights. For a moment he was disoriented, unsure of where he was or how he got there. His head felt heavy, his chest ached, and his throat was parched. He blinked slowly, eye trying to focus. A nurse noticed his movement and approached his bedside, placing a hand gently on his arm and speaking in a soothing tone. "You're awake," she said softly, smiling. "You gave us quite a fright." James tried to speak, but his voice was barely audible. "What happened?" "You collapsed in the garden," she explained. "Severe arrhythmia, likely caused by stress or an underlying issue. But you're very fortunate. Someone called 911 almost instantly. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Without that call, you might not be here." He frowned, the memory vague and distant. "Who called?" The nurse paused, then gave him a curious glance. "Two little girls. 5 years old, we were told. They saw you fall, and one of them dialed emergency services using a phone their grandmother gave them. They stayed with you until the paramedics arrived." James blinked in disbelief. "Little girls?" "Yes," the nurse nodded. "Apparently they were on their way to visit their mother here at the clinic. She's in a coma." The girls didn't linger for recognition. They just continued on their way. Extraordinary, really. He leaned back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling, absorbing the weight of that revelation. The idea of two young children noticing him, recognizing the danger, and acting in such a critical moment was almost unreal. In his world, everything was deliberate. Success was gauged by results driven by reason, not feeling. Yet here he was, alive because of the quiet bravery of two children he had never met. By the next morning, James's condition had stabilized enough for visitors. His assistant arrived with flowers and papers, already discussing rescheduling meetings and adjusting appointments, but James stopped him. "Find out who those girls are," he said quietly. "I want to meet them." Later that day, a young doctor handed him the emergency report. There, scribbled in the paran, a medic's notes, were the names Lily and Ava Stone. They had provided their grandmother's phone number during the 911 call. That was enough. James didn't hesitate. He asked a clinic volunteer to help locate their mother's room and insisted on walking there himself despite the nurse's objections. The walk was slow, his legs were still weak, and he leaned slightly on the corridor railings. But something urged him forward, a need to see these girls for himself, to look into their eyes and say thank you, not out of duty, but from something deeper he couldn't yet articulate. When he reached the small, shared pediatric waiting area, he spotted them instantly. Two little girls sitting side by side on a bench, identical in every way. Wavy golden hair, hazel eyes, white dresses slightly wrinkled from the long day. One was reading a tattered picture book, while the other quietly swung her legs. They looked up as he approached, their faces curious but unafraid. James stopped a few feet away, unsure how to start. "Are you Lily and Ava?" he asked gently. The girls exchanged a glance, then nodded together. He smiled, something warm and unfamiliar in his expression. "I think you saved my life." Lily's eyes widened slightly. "You were the man in the garden?" James nodded. "I was, and I'm very fortunate you were there." Ava stood up, her voice calm and direct. "I called the ambulance. I knew the number." "I know," he said. "You were very brave, both of you." The girls glanced at each other again. There was no pride in their faces, no seeking of praise. They had done what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. That quiet strength stirred something inside James. These weren't just children, they were survivors, small, strong, and bearing far more than they should at their age. "Can I sit with you for a moment?" he asked. They nodded. He lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside them, wincing slightly from the effort. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lily pointed across the hall toward a quiet room with the blinds closed. "That's where our mom is. She doesn't wake up. James looked at the room, then back at her. "I'm sorry. That must be very hard." Ava shrugged lightly, though her eyes betrayed the weight behind the gesture. "We visit her. Grandma says she might wake up if we keep talking to her." He nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. These children carried heartbreak like school bags, yet they'd found the strength to save a stranger in the midst of it all. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card. "This is my number," he said. "If you or your grandma ever need anything, you can call me." Ava took the card carefully. "Are you a doctor?" He smiled. "No, I build buildings, tall ones, but I'd like to help however I can." The girls seemed unsure how to respond, so he stood slowly, thanked them again, and turned to leave. As he walked back to his room, the clinic hall felt different, less sterile, more human. He couldn't stop thinking about those girls, about how easily the world could have lost him that day, and about how, despite all his wealth, influence, and planning, it was two small children who brought him back. And without realizing it, they'd sparked something that would transform their lives. The next few days passed slowly for James as he remained in the clinic under close watch. Though he was recovering physically, something inside him wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the meetings he was missing or the corporate chaos awaiting him. Instead, he saw two tiny hands, a blue toy phone, two pairs of solemn hazel eyes. His thoughts kept circling back to Lily and Ava, two 5-year-old girls who should have been thinking about dolls or bedtime tales, but instead had grown accustomed to clinic corridors, nurses' footsteps, and the sound of monitors beeping beside their mother's bed. James had known control in every form. He'd constructed towers, turned failing properties into empires, and negotiated massive deals without hesitation. But nothing in his life had prepared him for what he was feeling now. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, more persistent, unshakable. These girls had entered his life by chance, but the weight of what they carried and the way they acted without pause unsettled him in the most unexpected way. They had seen a man collapse and didn't hesitate. They didn't flee. They helped because to them, helping was just what you do, even if you're 5, even if your world is already crumbling. Unable to ignore the pull, James asked his assistant to investigate discreetly. What he learned only deepened the ache. The girl's mother, Sarah Stone, had been in a coma since a car accident nearly 6 weeks prior. Their father had vanished years earlier, and their only guardian now was their elderly grandmother in her late 70s, struggling to cover medical costs and the needs of two lively young girls. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town, and the clinic was a 30-minute walk away. That meant the girls had walked to the clinic alone the day they found him, not out of adventure, but out of necessity. James sat alone in his clinic bed for a long time after reading the report. Something inside him cracked open further. He thought of himself at 5 years old, the son of a property magnate, shuttled around by chauffeurs and tutors, never once worrying about a parent in the hospital or how to get there. His world had been orderly, structured, and in many ways detached from reality. He had grown up learning how to succeed, how to dominate, how to thrive in boardrooms, but he had never learned how to cope with uncertainty or pain, or the kind of invisible burden that children like Lily and Ava carried daily. He couldn't stop thinking about how small they had looked on that clinic bench, their feet swinging above the floor, their eyes far too wise for their age. He recalled Ava's calm certainty when she said she might wake up if we keep talking to her, as if hope were a flame to be guarded against the wind. By the time James was discharged from the clinic, he knew he couldn't return to normal, not the way he had known it before. The office sent a car to retrieve him, but he asked the driver to take him elsewhere first. He told no one. He didn't bring flowers or gifts this time. He simply returned to the clinic and asked for Sarah Stone's room. When he arrived, the girls were there, sitting on either side of the bed. Sarah lay still, her eyes closed, her breathing faint but steady. Lily was gently brushing her mother's hair with a small plastic comb, while Ava whispered a story about a sparrow that lost its way in a storm but found its home again. The moment they saw James, their faces brightened, not with the excitement children reserve for heroes, but with a quiet familiarity that made him feel he belonged. He asked if he could sit. They nodded. No one asked why he returned, and he didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. The nurse came in briefly, checked Sarah's monitors, and smiled softly at the girls. "She's stable," she said, glancing at James, "but no real change yet." He nodded, but said nothing. After a few minutes of silence, he turned to Lily. "Do you ever get scared?" She didn't look up immediately. Then she said, "Sometimes, but Ava says it's okay to be scared, as long as we keep going." Ava nodded solemnly. "Grandma says we're strong girls, so we try to be." James sat back, watching them. There were no tears, no outbursts, just a quiet resilience that wrapped around them like armor. And he realized something then. These girls didn't need saving. They weren't victims. They were warriors in dresses. But they did need support, someone to ease the weight just enough so they could breathe. He returned every day after that. Sometimes he brought coloring books. Sometimes he just sat beside them. He spoke softly to Sarah, though she never responded. He read stories aloud, ones the girls chose. They took turns holding the book with him, as if it were something sacred. And in that small room, with a clinic blanket draped over Sarah's legs and the sound of two girls humming softly, James Brooks began to feel more human than he ever had in his life. He didn't know what this was becoming, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to know. The rain began to fall as James stepped out of the clinic later that week, but he hardly noticed. His mind was full, the kind of full that slowed time, stretched by thoughts he couldn't shake. For days, he had been visiting Sarah's room regularly, always greeted by Lily and Ava, who now saw his presence as familiar, rather than odd. The staff stopped asking questions, simply nodding as he arrived each day with coffee in one hand and a small gift for the girls in the other. Nothing lavish, just things to make their clinic time easier. Storybooks, stickers, puzzles. He didn't do it to impress them. He did it because it felt right, real. He had learned more about Sarah Stone in a week than about most of his board members in a year. She had been a nurse at a local health center before the accident, known for her patience, her steady presence, her ability to make people feel understood. She had raised the girls alone after their father left, never once complaining, working double shifts to pay rent while still cooking dinner each night. James read this in her personnel files, gathered quietly by his assistant. But it wasn't just the words that lingered. It was the image of two little girls holding her hubby child, and day after day, never losing hope, never seeking pity. That evening, he sat in his sleek penthouse, surrounded by modern furniture, glass walls, and a silence so deep it almost had weight. The city lights flickered below, but he didn't look. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank page, wondering how two 5-year-olds had pierced every defense he'd built over decades. He could still hear Lily's small voice asking, "Do you think she knows we're here?" And Ava's calm certainty, "Of course she does. She knows everything." That moment, so innocent, so sure, had shaken him. The next morning, he arrived at the clinic earlier than usual. The girls weren't there yet, and Sarah's room was quiet. James sat beside her bed and looked at her face, wondering what strength it took to live her life. Her cheeks were pale, her breathing shallow, but her expression was calm. He spoke softly, not expecting her to hear, but needing to voice the words. "You raised two remarkable girls," he said, "and they don't even realize it. They think this is normal, being this brave, carrying this much. They think that's just how it works." He paused, watching her chest rise and fall. "They saved my life. They didn't hesitate, and I think I owe you something for that, not just gratitude, more than that. I don't know what yet, but I'm not walking away." That day, James took action the only way he knew, using the influence he'd spent his life building. He didn't publicize it, didn't share it online. He simply called a top neurologist in the country, arranged for a second evaluation of Sarah's condition, and offered to fund any advanced treatments available. Within 24 hours, Sarah was moved to a private room with better equipment, specialized monitoring, and a new team of doctors. The girls were too young to grasp the changes, but their grandmother noticed. She approached James one afternoon in the hallway, her voice trembling with fatigue and gratitude. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said quietly, "but thank you. They needed someone." James looked her in the eyes and replied with something that surprised even him. "So did I." That night, As he watched the girls color quietly at the foot of their mother's bed, something inside him settled. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or deadlines or press releases. He was thinking about what it meant to matter, not in headlines or balance sheets, but in someone's real life, in a room where nothing was expected of him except presence and patience. He didn't fully understand where this was heading, but he knew he wasn't done showing up, not for Sarah, not for Lily and Ava, and not for the part of himself that was finally starting to awaken. Sarah's medical progress was slow, but there were signs, small ones, that gave everyone hope. She was still in a coma, but her reflexes responded to light and sound. Her breathing grew steadier, more regular. The doctors didn't make promises, but their updates grew slightly more hopeful each day. Still, it was Lily and Ava who carried the most hope in the room. They never stopped talking to her, never stopped holding her hand or brushing her hair or showing her their drawings. It wasn't just routine. It was ritual, an unspoken belief that their presence, their voices, their stories could keep their mother tethered to the world. James watched this unfold with quiet awe. He had never known children who loved so fiercely, yet so gently. He had also rarely spent more than a few minutes around children in his adult life, yet here he was, spending hours in a clinic room with two girls who had somehow become part of his world. He began learning their rhythms. Lily liked to hum softly while coloring. Ava liked to gather facts about birds, clouds, clinic machines, reciting them like little charms. They both had favorite colors, snacks, jokes, and dreams of becoming pilots to fly their mother to see the stars up close. But for all their strength, James started noticing the cracks. Lily got headaches from lack of sleep. Ava's voice grew softer in the evenings. Their clothes, though clean, were visibly worn. Their grandmother tried her best, but she was clearly overwhelmed, shuffling through hallways slowly, her hands trembling, her face pale with exhaustion. James offered help, small things at first, rides, meals, errands. She always thanked him, always hesitated, but never refused. It was clear that without support, the family would soon be pushed beyond its limits. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in chairs pulled close to their mother's bed, James stepped into the hallway and made a call. Not to a doctor or lawyer, but to his therapist, someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. He didn't talk about business, stress, or burnout. He spoke about two little girls who made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Responsibility, not for profit, but for care. He talked about feeling like an outsider who wanted to stay, about realizing that everything he'd built in his career felt hollow next to Ava's laughter, or Lily leaning her head on his shoulder while talking about the moon. The conversation didn't solve anything, but it helped him admit something to himself. He didn't just care about these girls, he needed them too. In saving his life, they had shaken something loose and he couldn't go back to pretending it didn't exist. That night he went home, sat at his untouched dining table, and made a decision. Not impulsive, but one that had been building since he awoke in the ICU. The next day, he met with a legal advisor, asking what it would take to establish a guardianship arrangement if needed. He didn't intend to take the girls from their grandmother, but he wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to Sarah, the girls would be protected, safe. He started a trust fund in their names, ensuring access to medical care, education, and anything else they needed without anyone having to ask. He didn't tell Lily and Ava about this, not yet. For them, the world was still measured in storybooks, coloring pages, and soft clinic blankets. They didn't need the weight of legal terms or financial safety nets. They just needed someone to keep showing up. And James did, every day. One afternoon, Ava climbed into the chair beside him and looked at him seriously. "Are you rich?" she asked. James laughed softly. "I suppose so. Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "You wear fancy shoes and your car has lots of buttons." Lily leaned over from across the room. "But you don't act rich. Rich people on TV are mean." James smiled. "Well, maybe TV gets it wrong." Ava tilted her head. "Are you going to leave when Mommy wakes up?" The question hit harder than he expected. He shook his head. "Not if you don't want me to." She didn't reply, just nodded and leaned her head against his arm. In that moment, James knew the truth had shifted. He wasn't visiting the clinic out of guilt or obligation or even admiration. He was there because he belonged, because those girls had pulled him out of a loneliness he hadn't realized he was drowning in, and because he wouldn't let them walk this path alone. Not now, not ever. James's days began to revolve around the clinic in a way he never anticipated. The office still functioned, the business move. It forward, but his presence there became secondary, a shadow of the man he once was in the corporate world. Meetings were handled by deputies. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. His staff grew quiet, confused, curious, but James offered no explanations. He wasn't hiding, just shifting away from the cold glass towers and towards something more grounded. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating returns or market growth. He was thinking about Sarah's heartbeat, Lily's tired eyes, Ava's endless questions, and how to keep them all from falling apart. Sarah's condition improved in subtle ways outsiders might not notice. Her fingers twitched when the girls touched her. Her breathing relied less on machines. The neurologists were cautiously hopeful. No one said miracle, but their voices softened daily. Lily and Ava never missed a visit, carrying hope like a shared secret, as if it were their duty to believe when no one else could. And James, who once trusted only logic and contracts, found himself joining their quiet faith without realizing it. One morning, James arrived to find the girls waiting in the hallway with small paper bags, decorated with stars and hearts. Inside were two slightly squashed strawberry muffins. They had asked the clinic cafeteria worker to help them make breakfast for Mr. James. It was the first time he felt his throat tighten in public. He sat between them on the bench, took a bite, and said it was the best thing he'd tasted in months. Lily giggled. Ava leaned her head on his shoulder. It was simple, small, yet felt like something sacred. But outside the warmth of clinic visits and story time, realities loomed. The girl's grandmother was weakening. Her blood pressure was unstable, and the strain of caring for the girls, managing chores and walking to the clinic, was taking its toll. James noticed her rubbing her back constantly, her hands trembling when signing visitor logs. One day, after watching her struggle to unlock her car door, he made a decision. Without consulting her, he arranged for a private caregiver to visit her home daily. A kind woman named Nora began helping with groceries, cleaning, and small tasks. The grandmother resisted at first, but eventually relented, too tired to refuse kindness. James didn't stop there. He hired a tutor to keep Lily and Ava engaged with schoolwork twice a week. He set up a credit line at a local pharmacy for medicine and supplies. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about building a safety net for people who had never had one. Yet the most unexpected part wasn't what he gave, but what he received. He began to laugh more. Real laughter, not corporate chuckles. He talked less about forecasts and more about bedtime routines and which stories made the girls fall asleep fastest. His assistant noticed the change. His board noticed too, but no one questioned it because James, once known for being distant and cold, now carried a softness in his face that hadn't been there before, a depth. One afternoon, as they sat in Sarah's room, Ava suddenly asked, "Did you always want to be rich?" James thought about it. "I think I always wanted to be significant," he said, "but I used to think being rich was the same thing." Ava frowned. "Is it not?" He smiled. "Not anymore." Later that day, as Lily and Ava took turns reading to their mother, Sarah's eyelids fluttered for a second, then again. The girls didn't see, but James did. His heart leapt. He stood and called for the nurse, who confirmed it. Brain activity, a reaction, a step forward. It wasn't consciousness, but it was something. James sat beside Sarah long after the girls left with their grandmother. He took her hand and spoke softly. "They're waiting for you. They never stopped. I've never seen love like that, Sarah. You gave them that. And they gave me something I didn't know I was missing." He didn't expect a reply, but he began to believe she heard every word. The morning Sarah opened her eyes began like any other. The clinic hallway hummed with the usual clatter of carts and distant voices. James arrived early, stopping by the cafe downstairs for hot chocolate for Lily and Ava. He carried the paper cups carefully, the familiar scent of cocoa mixing with clinic disinfectant as he entered the pediatric wing. But before he reached the girls, a nurse met him near the door, her expression unreadable, then shifting to something warm and incredulous. She touched his arm gently and said, "She's awake." For a moment he couldn't speak. The words lingered as if his mind couldn't grasp them. "Sarah?" he asked quietly, confirming. The nurse nodded. "She opened her eyes about 30 minutes ago. She can't speak yet, but she's responsive, blinking to questions, squeezed my hand when I asked if she knew her daughter's names." James stood frozen. Something swelled in his chest, forcing him to breathe deeply to steady himself. He handed the drinks to the nurse and hurried to the room, his heart racing with each step. Inside, Sarah lay in bed, pale but present. Her eyes were open, her gaze alert, holding depth, memory, recognition. James approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head weakly toward him and blinked once. He sat beside her, his voice trembling with relief and awe. "Hi, Sarah," he said softly. "You've got two girls who never gave up on you. Not for 1 second." A tear slipped down her cheek. She tried to speak, but her throat caught. James took her hand gently. "Don't try yet. Just rest. You're safe. They're okay. They're amazing." He stayed until the girls arrived, running down the hall, laughing as they often did, unaware of what awaited. When they entered and saw their mother looking at them, their laughter stopped. Lily dropped her stuffed toy. Ava froze. Sarah blinked slowly, and the girls rushed forward, wrapping their arms around her carefully, afraid to hurt her, but unable to hold back. Lily was crying. Ava's voice cracked as she whispered, "You came back." Sarah's fingers trembled as they brushed through their curls. It was a fragile reunion, but real. The medical team confirmed the miracle they'd hoped for. Sarah's recovery would be slow, physical therapy, speech recovery, long-term care, but her awakening was extraordinary. Every nurse who knew the case said the same. This shouldn't have been possible, not this soon, not after so long. But no one questioned it. Love had done what science couldn't measure. James became a fixture in her recovery, just as he had in the girls' lives. He spoke with doctors, arranged in-home care, and began redesigning his second property to accommodate a long-term family residence. His penthouse had never felt like home, but this new place, a sunlit house near a quiet park, already carried something warmer. One afternoon, as Sarah practiced speech exercises with a therapist, James sat with the girls on a bench outside. They were eating ice cream, the sun casting soft golden light across their faces. Lily looked up suddenly and asked, "Are you going to leave now that Mommy's better?" The question hit harder than he expected. He shook his head immediately. "No, I'm not going anywhere." Ava wiped her mouth and said, "Even if she doesn't remember you?" "She will," he said quietly. "But even if she didn't, I'd still stay." A few days later, Sarah was strong enough to sit in a wheelchair and go outside. James pushed her down a quiet path in the clinic garden while the girls ran ahead, weaving between trees, laughing with the freedom only children know. Sarah looked at him, her voice raspy but deliberate. "You've done more than I can ever repay." He shook his head. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed. I think we're even." She smiled weakly but sincerely. "They love you." He looked at the girls who had stopped to pick dandelions. "I love them too." Sarah touched his arm lightly. "You know they saved you, but I think you saved them back." That night, after the girls were asleep and Sarah was resting, James stayed in the clinic garden. The sky was deep blue, stars blinking quietly into place. He leaned back on the bench, hands folded, letting the silence settle. This life wasn't what he'd planned. No PowerPoint, no forecasts, no exit strategy. But it was his. Earned not by strategy, but by staying, showing up, refusing to walk away. He looked at the sky, closed his eyes, and whispered something he hadn't said in years, not in boardrooms or interviews, but here under a quiet sky. "Thank you." Months passed, and their new life settled into something close to normal. Sarah continued to heal, her strength returning steadily. There were days she struggled to sit up, when words came slowly or her balance faltered in therapy, but she faced each setback with the same quiet resolve that shaped her daughters. The girls, no longer tied to clinic routines, returned to school with bright backpacks and brighter eyes, carrying the resilience built during those long days by their mother's bedside. James remained a constant, not out of duty, but because leaving never crossed his mind. He found something among them that boardrooms, luxury suites, or gala dinners never offered: a reason to stay. He spent more time with the girls than with anyone in his professional world. He learned to braid wavy golden hair on rushed school mornings, though his fingers fumbled at first. He helped Ava build birdhouses in the garage and sat patiently through Lily's endless puppet shows, often dramatic retellings of fairy tales mixed with clinic memories. When Sarah was strong enough to walk the garden alone, she watched them from the porch, eyes shining with wordless gratitude. She had returned from the edge of death to find her family whole and unexpectedly larger. One evening, James invited them to dinner at the house he'd once bought as a quiet retreat, a place he thought he'd use rarely. Now it felt lived in, filled with laughter, the scent of baking cookies, the occasional trail of toys across the hall. Sarah wore a soft green dress and walked slowly but proudly into the dining room, her daughters holding her hands. The table was beautifully set, and a private chef, fond of the girls, prepared their favorites. Lily insisted on saying grace, though no one was particularly religious. Everyone closed their eyes as she thanked the universe for moms who wake up, for men who stay, and for cooking ice that don't burn. After dinner, as the girls played with flashlights in a blanket fort in the living room, James and Sarah sat on the back patio. The sun had set, the air warm, the kind of evening that lingers in memory. Sarah turned to him slowly, her voice still fragile but her gaze steady. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Really?" He didn't answer immediately, watching the stars scattered like breadcrumbs across the night. Then he turned to her. "Because I didn't want to keep building a life that only looked good from the outside. I didn't realize how empty everything was until your daughters showed me what it means to be needed, not for my money or name, but just as me." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "They needed someone, but they didn't need saving. That's the thing about them. They don't know how remarkable they are. They just keep going." "They remind me of someone else I know," he replied. They sat in silence, letting the stillness speak. Inside, the girls had fallen asleep in their fort, two small bodies tangled in blankets and dreams. James carried them to the guest room one by one, tucking them in with care, memorizing how they liked their pillows. Sarah watched from the doorway, leaning on her cane, a quiet smile on her face. The following weekend, the four visited the garden where it all began. Sarah walked slowly, steps uncertain but determined, James steadying her arm. The girls ran ahead, shrieking with laughter, racing toward the statue. When they reached the spot where they'd found James months ago, Ava turned and said, "This is where it all changed, right?" James nodded. "Yes, right here." Lily stood beside her sister, hands on hips like a little commander. "You looked like a sleeping giant." James laughed. "I felt like one too." Sarah took a slow breath, standing quietly on the path's edge, and somehow two tiny girls woke him up. He looked at her, eyes so far, and "They didn't just wake me up, they saved me." That night, back at the house, James passed the guest room and saw the girls fast asleep, their faces peaceful, framed by golden curls. He stood in the doorway a long moment before turning away. In the months ahead, there would be challenges. Recovery would continue. Sarah would face good days and bad. The girls would grow, ask harder questions, learn new truths. But one thing was certain. They would face it together, a togetherness born not of obligation, but of choice, of love found in unexpected places. When one man fell and two children refused to pass by, James no longer needed towers to feel tall. He had found something stronger than success: family. In my view, the ending of this story holds a rare and profound beauty, one that doesn't rely on dramatic turns or grand acts, but on quiet change and emotional truth. It's not just about a man being saved physically, it's about a soul rebuilt through connection, vulnerability, and unexpected love. James begins as a man defined by success and isolation, yet ends as someone who discovers the deeper meaning of presence, family, and purpose. That journey is deeply human and profoundly hopeful. What moves me most is that the story never makes the children seem like symbols or tools for his growth. Lily and Ava are real, small, brave, joyful, scarred, but never broken. They ask for little, yet give everything. And in return, James doesn't just help them, he lets himself be changed by them. That emotional reciprocity, across generations and social divides, is rare in fiction and rarer in life. This isn't a fairy tale with a perfect bow. It's better, about messy healing, quiet loyalty, and the surprising places redemption begins. The fact that it starts with a fall in the garden and ends with a shared life reminds us sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the beginnings of everything extraordinary.